Welcome to this video study of Daniel chapter 6. My name is Bob Pulliam and I'm the evangelist for the Charlotte Church of Christ. We meet at 5327 South Tryon Street in Charlotte, North Carolina. We hope that perhaps you can come and visit us sometime, or if you live close by in the area, maybe you'll take a close look at the work here and see if you might want to join your hands with ours. We want to go to heaven, and we would love for you to join us on that journey. Chapter 6 of Daniel is a very, very interesting chapter in Daniel. It presents to us lessons that reach from the youngest child all the way to the oldest adult. I've entitled this chapter, God Punishes the Wicked. That God watches over His people has been a constant theme through the book of Daniel so far. But when we get to chapter 6, we still see that God is taking care of Daniel. He has His eye on him all the time. And yet there is something added to this. Now, we noted in our study of chapter 3 that there are similarities between chapter 3 and chapter 6. But they're not exactly equal. They teach some of the same lessons, but there's something additional that occurs at the end of chapter 6. We have the intrigue, the mayhem, the attempt to destroy people who worship God. We have the people of God standing up and they serve God even in the face of death. And all of this is in chapter 6. But then we add the feature of the wicked being punished. And it's important for the Hebrew to remember that God does in fact punish the wicked. It may not come as quickly as it does for these men in chapter 6, but we do know that God is patient, and yet at the same time He does punish the wicked. This is a theme that runs through the Bible. The recurring thread is that it doesn't matter how long it takes, the wicked will be recompensed for their evil deeds. Now, when we look at the circumstances here, we find circumstances that they're really repeated throughout history. Just in the secular world, for that matter. And that is people grasping for power, jealous of others who have power, and then doing what they have to do to claw their eyes out, to pull their feet off of the rungs of the ladder, to cast them down. And that's what we find going on here. We find that Daniel has distinguished himself among those who are wise in Babylon. Darius is on the throne. We talked about Darius a little bit at the end of chapter 5. And Darius, by the way, I pronounce it Darius. Some people say, no, it has to be Darius. And, you know, I tell folks when it comes to Bible names, those folks are dead. They don't really care how you pronounce their names. But in all seriousness, there is a debate on how to pronounce that. My two major Bible encyclopedias, they give a pronunciation of Darius, and so I pronounce it that way. And we need to just accept each other's pronunciations and get along. We also don't know who this Darius is for sure. We do know that he came to rule. We talked about this also at the end of chapter 5. And he may have been a governor in the province. Some have proposed this. And he was given rule over Babylonia while Cyrus was doing things elsewhere. But as I mentioned at the end of chapter 5, the end of chapter 6 provides a verse that seems to maybe indicate that Darius and Cyrus are actually the same person. I don't know what way is correct. No one's really resolved this to any satisfaction. We just need more information from that time that we don't have. And so we'll just be content with what we have and wait for that. But here we have Darius. He's appointed 120 satraps over the kingdom. This accords with history, the way that the Persians did things, and particularly Cyrus. but undoubtedly Darius as well. And there are three men who rise to the top, like cream rising to the top of the mixture. But one in particular distinguishes himself. And so in verse 3, we read that the king was planning to appoint him over the entire kingdom. In other words, you have three gone to the top, and then one of those three, Daniel, he's rising above that. Now, the satraps, they do not like this, and I imagine those other two men in those three spots, those other two men, I bet they really did not like that. And so they begin seeking an occasion against him so that they might accuse him and drag him off of the ladder, so that he not only can't climb anymore, but he gets off the ladder. When we look at verses 4 and 5, the officials have a plan to take him out. They begin trying to find it in some way, perhaps with corruption that he may be involved in. But at the end of verse 4, they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Find it interesting that that verse is worded in that way. Kind of makes me think that maybe they were involved in corruption, and they knew that if he got to the top, he was not going to tolerate their corruption. So whatever schemes they had, embezzlements, whatever they may have been involved in, it was going to be at risk. So that, that kind of presents an interesting motivation for them. And so in verse 5, these men say, "We shall not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God." And so the reader already knew that there wasn't going to be anything wrong with Daniel, but this really jumps out at us. It's going to have two effects. The plan is really a stroke of genius for wickedness. The immediate effect is going to be that of making them look like they are really loyal to the king. And so the plot has that immediate advantage if nothing else happens. But then the second advantage for them is that it's going to take Daniel out of the picture. And so the plan seems to work at the very beginning. The plan is found in verses 6 through 8, and it involves getting King Darius to establish an injunction that no one can make any petition or offer any prayer to any other god or man besides Darius for 30 days. And if they do so, then they're going to be cast into the den of lions. This plays upon the king's pride, and the pride that he has here is that his men would think so much of him. And it sounds really good, and he does not think about any consequences that might come of this. And so in verse 9, he signs the document, that is the injunction. When we come to verses 10 and 11, we have Daniel now knowing that the document was signed. Let's just read these two verses. In Daniel 6, verses 10 and 11, when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber, he had windows open toward Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. When we look at what Daniel is doing here, Daniel is praying, and he has open windows, and the immediate thought that runs to our mind is that this is the way that they're going to catch him. They know that he has open windows, and they just need to get across the way, and while he's praying, they'll be able to see him in there. But there are a couple of things that we need to keep in mind with respect to this. First of all, it assumes that when he's kneeling, there is not a half wall below those windows, perhaps, that's going to obstruct him. Someone says, well, there must not have been because they could see him, but you're assuming that they were way over there across the way looking in. And that brings me to the question, how do they know that as he's kneeling there in his chamber and he's praying, that he's not praying or petitioning Darius in his prayers? Okay, well, we need to establish that in order to bring the charge against him. Something that we miss in all of this is the architecture of the day. This was not Daniel's chamber, it was his roof chamber. And the architecture of that day for someone who was a noble was such that you had the house proper, but then on top of the house you would have a roof chamber. You would have an area that was devoted to the ability to cool off in the hot desert sun. And so here is Daniel. He goes up to his roof chamber. That's where he usually prays. This roof chamber, as it is called here, a roof chamber, has that purpose of catching the desert breeze and allowing a person to cool off rather than be down in a room with stagnant air. Now, in order for a roof chamber to do that, a roof chamber had to be open on all sides. So someone says, well, why does he have windows open toward Jerusalem? That has to be an understanding not of that's the way they're going to catch him, but of what he is actually engaged in, the prayers that he is offering unto God. So let me draw your attention to a passage in 1 Kings chapter 8. And 1 Kings chapter 8 is really going to give us the answer as to why anybody would have been praying toward Jerusalem to begin with. And so let's pick up in verse 46, and the setting here is Solomon dedicating the temple. And when he dedicates the temple, he offers a prayer to God. And as he offers this prayer to God, he makes request of God over and over again that anyone who prays toward this temple, that you would hear in heaven and that you would grant their petition. And this section right here in chapter 8 is particularly interesting. It's a long section, or I'd read the whole thing. It begins in verse 31 it begins back in verse 25. And so we have a prayer that's being offered to God about this temple, and this section says in verse 46 of 1 Kings 8, when they sin against thee, for there is no man who does not sin, and thou art angry with them and dost deliver them into an enemy, so that they take them away captive to the land of the enemy, far off or near. Now that's where the Israelites are, and that's where Daniel is. He has been taken by the enemy to a land far off. So verse 47, if they take thought in the land where they have taken captive, and repent and make supplication to thee in the land of those who have taken them captive, saying, we have sinned and have committed iniquity, we have acted wickedly. If they return to thee with all their heart, with all their soul, in the land of their enemies, which is where Daniel is, who have taken them captive, and pray toward thee in this land which thou hast given to their fathers, the city which thou hast chosen, and the house which I have built for thy name, then hear their prayer and their supplication in heaven, thy dwelling place, and maintain their cause. And so, if they're in this situation and they pray toward this place, toward this temple, toward Jerusalem, then hear in heaven thy dwelling place and grant their plea. Well, the point then that we have here in Daniel chapter 6 and verse 10, that he had windows open toward Jerusalem, is that his practice was to do what a good Jew would do, what a faithful, trusting Jew who really believed that God kept his promises, answered the prayers of the faithful. Daniel is doing this, and that's the point of windows open toward Jerusalem. How did they get into the roof chamber? Well, it's open on all sides. And I suspect that he was probably praying out loud. If not, they could have asked him who he was praying to. He would have been honest with them. But he may very well have been praying out loud. And coming into the roof chamber there really wasn't anything between them and Daniel to get there to him. So that's one of those things where, how did they get there? How did they know? They're kind of irrelevant. The architecture and the wording of the text tells us a great deal, but it doesn't tell us what we sometimes try to get out of the text. The main thing is that we understand what we have at the end of verse 10, and that is that this is what he had always done. In other words, he didn't change what he had been doing simply because he might die for doing it. And so they can come and they can have him arrested, they can haul him before Darius, and he can be thrown into a den of lions, but he is still going to offer his prayers unto his God. And so what we're learning here is not just that Daniel is faithful, but we're learning that one of God's faithful men has been put into this position by wicked men, and we're going to see God takes care of those who are faithful to him. So the trap then is sprung, and in verses 12 through 14 we have Daniel being reported to the king. I might point out a language feature here in this text. In verse 11, these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before God. And so they go to the king and they tattle on him, they squeal on him. But notice that they came by agreement. The text says they came thronging. In other words, there was an alliance that was involved here. This is the same thing that we have back in verse 6 when these commissioners and satraps, they come to Darius. It says that they came thronging. In other words, they came by agreement. They came under an alliance. And so they were allied together. Today we would call it a conspiracy. Then in verse 15 we read about them pressing the king to enforce his decree. And we read that these men came by agreement to the king and said, so they come thronging. In other words, their alliance, they're standing as one man against Daniel in order to cause this to happen. And of course that's somewhat important later on when they are punished. They are punished as a group. And that's the way God is going to handle it, since the conspiracy was handled as a group as well. And so the king doesn't want to do this. In verses 16 through 18, we read about his trepidation here. He says at the end of verse 16, your God whom you constantly serve will himself deliver you. There's some question on exactly how that should be translated. We want the king to make a bold statement of faith. Your God will deliver you. But the wording here is such that he could be saying, may your God do this. And later on that seems to be kind of his disposition. It's not that he's a man of faith who believes with all his heart this is going to happen, because when he comes to the den the next morning, in verse 20, he asks the question, has your God been able to deliver you? Well, God can deliver, and we know that. The faithful know that, but the king didn't know that, but he's about to learn that. So Daniel is thrown in. He spends the night there. An angel of the Lord, we're told in verse 22 of Daniel 6, he shuts the lions' mouths so that they would not harm him. And so Daniel is able to report unharmed to the king, and he is pulled out. But now those men who caused this to happen, they are going to be dealt with. And so in verse 24, the king gives orders, and they throw them into the den of lions. And we're told that before they ever even reached the bottom of the den, the lions had overpowered them and crushed all their bones. This answers the question as to whether or not they were really hungry. And the answer is yes. So we have the important decree of verses 26 and 27. Here Darius says, I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and enduring forever, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. As we go forward into the second section, this decree is not only important for what Darius has confessed about God being a God who delivers, but also from the standpoint that he says his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. That's the prophecies of the remainder of the book. Perhaps we don't notice it, but Darius is introducing for us the subject matter for the last half of the book, and that is kingdoms are going to come and kingdoms are going to go, but the kingdom of God, it will stand, it will be victorious, and it will be enduring. I hope that you've enjoyed this study of chapter 6. We're going to go on with chapter 7. We're going to learn again about the 4 kingdoms that we saw in chapter 2, but we're going to see more detail given about those kingdoms and about what God has intended. And then as we go on into the remainder of the book, we're going to see more and more detail about the future being revealed, which of course gives us cause for faith, because as we look at those prophecies, we see that they were fulfilled in great detail as well. Well, thank you for being with us. I hope that you'll take part in the remainder of our study.